The quiet days of the town were upended by a storm we felt approaching one afternoon. Riverside Junction, known for its tranquility, remained undisturbed until the distant roar of engines signaled the arrival of the Iron Serpents. To them, this place seemed like an ordinary stop, but they would soon realize how wrong they were. But before I dive into the story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel to show your support. The sun blazed fiercely across the Texas sky that afternoon as I stood at the gas pump, filling up my car. Even the shade of the roof couldn't soften the heat. It had been a few months since I moved to Riverside Junction, a place I chose for its quiet. I needed the silence. The past few years of my life had been a whirlwind of war and chaos. But that day, the silence was destined to be shattered forever. As I placed the pump back into its slot, I heard the sound of engines for the first time. Something inside me stirred. A deep intuition honed over years of hardship whispered that something was wrong. 6 large motorcycles were approaching the station, their metallic gleam blinding in the sun and blending with the dust clouds they kicked up. They were the Iron Serpents. I'd heard of them before, notorious in and around Riverside. The riders dismounted their bikes. Their leader, a heavily tattooed man with a thick beard, moved like a predator. When his eyes locked onto mine, there was a menacing mockery in his gaze. Having stared into the eyes of death on battlefields, I could feel the threat emanating from this man. But one thing was certain. I wasn't about to be intimidated. "Beautiful day, isn't it, sweetheart?" he said, his tone dripping with a smug, unsettling sarcasm. I recognized his game instantly, and I had no intention of being a pawn in it. "Just getting gas," I replied, keeping my composure steady. The grin faded from his face. "These roads can be dangerous," he said, gesturing to his crew. They slowly surrounded me, behaving as though they owned the place. Inside the station, the young clerk stared wide-eyed, frozen as he watched the unfolding scene. When they began hinting at their so-called protection services, I finally understood their intent. They wanted control over Riverside Junction, but what they didn't know was that I had come here to write my own story. They had picked the wrong person to threaten. They were up against a battlefield nurse who had already seen the worst the world could throw at her. As they issued their taunts, I was already forming a plan in my head. Yes, the quiet of this town would be broken today, but this was only the beginning. One thing was clear. I was no easy target. Their menacing demeanor shattered the peace of the town. Inside, the young clerk, Bobby, cowered behind the counter in fear. Meanwhile, Frank, the station owner, watched us through the dusty window, his hand resting firmly on the shotgun beneath the counter. But I didn't retreat, not even a step, despite being surrounded by these men who clearly saw me as their next target. Their leader, a man I later learned was called Chains, fixed his predatory gaze on me. His eyes held the cold intensity of a hunter stalking its prey. "Listen, sweetheart," he began, his voice carrying a threatening softness. "These roads are ours. If you're doing business here, you'll need to make a deal with us." It didn't take a genius to understand his meaning. Years on the battlefield had made me accustomed to veiled threats and empty promises. Chains wasn't just after a deal, he wanted complete control of Riverside Junction. But one thing was certain, I wasn't about to be his victim. "I'm just here to do my job," I replied calmly. My voice wasn't threatening, nor was it timid. It was steady. That steadiness didn't sit well with Chains. One of his men kicked at the gas pump, a sharp move that made Frank grip his shotgun tighter behind the counter. "This won't be so simple," Chains said, stepping closer. His tone had shifted, becoming more aggressive. "If you don't play by the rules, things in Riverside won't go so smoothly." As his threat hung in the air, I watched every movement of the bikers circling me. My mind raced, calculating possibilities, escape routes, potential weapons, their vulnerabilities. Every skill I'd honed over the years came rushing back. "I don't care about your rules," I finally said, locking eyes with him. "If you're planning to take over this town, you should know I'll be the first obstacle in your way." Chain's face tightened, his expression growing darker. As they continued their intimidation, the few customers nearby ducked into their cars. Yet I stood my ground. Chains took another step toward me, but before he could speak, Frank's voice rang out from inside the station. "I suggest you leave. Now." Chains and I didn't break eye contact for several tense seconds. Finally, he smirked, a thin, humorless grin that couldn't conceal the anger underneath. "This is just the beginning," he said, motioning to his men to return to their bikes. As they mounted their motorcycles, I kept my eyes fixed on Chains. Dust rose in their wake as they roared away, leaving a silence heavy with foreboding. One thing had become crystal clear. This town would never be the same, but I knew how to fight, and I was determined to win this battle. After Chains and his bikers left town, I stepped inside the station. Frank was still behind the counter, clutching his shotgun tightly. His worry was evident, though he tried to appear calm. Bobby, meanwhile, was curled up in a corner, his wide eyes fixed on us. I knew I had to say something to ease their nerves. "Not now," I told Frank, "but they'll be back. They won't just leave it at this." Frank, recognizing the weight of my words, nodded slowly, seemingly convinced by my experience in dealing with danger. "What do we do? Will calling the police be enough?" he asked. "The police might help, but this is bigger than just a threat. This is an organized attack. If we plan carefully, we can protect this town." Frank looked surprised, but in Bobby's eyes I saw a flicker of hope. Perhaps for the first time, someone was suggesting they could stand up to men like Chains. One of the most important lessons I'd learned from years in war zones was this: fear paralyzes unless it's met with organized resistance. The next morning, Frank and I began visiting the town's key locations. Our first stop was Riverside High, where we spoke to Maria Delgado, a local teacher. Like many others in the town, Maria was deeply concerned about what she'd heard of Chains and his gang. But she also carried the quiet courage that came with her role as an educator. "How are you going to organize us?" she asked. "We're going to make a plan," I replied. "Everyone will have a role. Alone, we're not strong, but together, we can stand against them." Maria's eyes lit up. "We can start with the students. I can teach them how to observe their surroundings and report anything suspicious." Encouraged by her enthusiasm, I continued meeting with other townsfolk. Dr. Chen suggested turning the clinic into an information hub where people could share what they knew and get updates on what needed to be done. James Washington, who ran the local auto repair shop, offered to turn his garage into a secure shelter. He planned to lock down the entrances and install extra security cameras. Meanwhile, Frank worked on adding security lights and cameras to the gas station. Slowly but steadily, the town was transforming into a network of defense. Our plan was taking shape one step at a time. That evening, at a town meeting, I addressed everyone with these words: "We all know Chains and his gang will return. The important question is how we'll face them. If we work together, we can make this town a place they can't conquer." After the meeting, as people began to disperse, Frank approached me. "Do you really think we can pull this off?" he asked. I turned to him, resolute. "We have to believe we can, because if we don't, we've already lost." Later that night, as the lights of the town went out one by one, I sat outside Miller's fuel stop, listening intently for the faintest sound of engines in the distance. I knew Chains would make his next move, but I also knew that we were ready to make ours. A few days after Chains left, the town lived under the tense shadow of his inevitable return. The gangs roamed the outskirts, seemingly inching closer with each passing day. During the day, the roads appeared calm, but by night, the faint hum of motorcycles could be heard in the distance. People sat by their windows, watching shadows under the streetlights, waiting for a sign of what was to come. At Miller's fuel stop, Bobby was testing our radio communications. The system we had set up would be our strongest line of defense. Frank checked the security cameras and ensured the lights were functioning properly. Meanwhile, I oversaw the preparations being made across the town. At the school, Maria Delgado was organizing a secure space with her students. "They're not just learning," she told me with pride. "They're learning how to protect themselves and their families." Her determination moved me. Turning fear into resistance and unity was one of the most powerful lessons I'd learned from war. Dr. Chen's clinic had become the town's central hub of information. Throughout the day, people came not only for medical help but also to report any suspicious activity. Dr. Chen marked defensive positions on a map spread across his desk. 3 motorcycles passed by the garage last night, Chen said, pointing to a spot on the map. They didn't do anything, but they made their presence known. At the garage, James Washington was taking precautions against potential Molotov attacks. "We know how far these guys are willing to go," he said through gritted teeth, "but this time, we're ready." With each passing day, the signs of an impending attack grew clearer. Reports over the radio confirmed that the gang was being spotted more frequently in the area. Inside, I could feel a storm brewing, a warning of the danger drawing closer. One evening, as the sun set, we gathered at Dr. Chen's clinic for a meeting. Frank, Bobby, Maria, James, and other townsfolk surrounded the map as we discussed our plans. "So far, they're just testing us," I said, studying the map. "They're probing for weak spots in different areas, but soon they'll launch their real attack." Deputy Kate Wilson, her brow furrowed, added, "We've learned that Chain's gang is growing. I've heard they're gathering at an old warehouse. This time, they'll bring more men." The room fell silent. I could see traces of fear in the people's eyes, but then a wave of determination followed. "We're not alone in this fight," I said. "Each of you is a part of the system we've built. If we all do our part to protect it, they won't break through. This isn't the kind of war they're used to. Our weapon is our unity." Maria pointed at the map. "The school, clinic, and garage will be key points in our defense line. If everyone knows their role, we can make this work." As the meeting concluded, the townsfolk began organizing tasks and heading home. Frank approached me, the lines on his face more pronounced. "This feels like war all over again," he said quietly. "This is a different kind of war," I replied. "But remember, this is our home. That's something they'll never understand." Later that night, Bobby and I sat watching the security camera feeds at Miller's fuel stop. The sky had clouded over, and the stars had disappeared. When I heard the faint hum of motorcycles on the horizon, I knew the calm wouldn't last much longer. The storm was coming. With the first light of day, a wave of tension spread across the town. For days, there had been signs that Chains and his gang were planning something. But today, those signs felt like they were about to become a full-blown attack. The air was heavy, the sky cloaked in a dull gray. This morning it was clear that the calm was merely the silence before the storm. The first report over our radio network came around 9 a.m. Bobby's excited voice crackled through the system. 3 more motorcycles spotted near the main road. Looks like they're heading toward the old warehouse. Frank set his coffee mug down on the counter, his face hardening with resolve. "That's their gathering point. They're planning something big," he said grimly. The town quickly sprang into action. Everyone took their positions. Maria guided the school children into a secure area. James Washington and his team fortified the garage entrance, reinforcing it with whatever they could find. Dr. Chen's clinic was fully prepared to function as both an information hub and a safe zone. By 11 a.m., the first wave of Chain's gang appeared. 4 motorcycles roared toward Miller's fuel stop, kicking up a cloud of dust. Their erratic movements were deliberate, an attempt to distract us. Bobby, glued to the security monitors, called out, "This is just the advance group. The main team is still at the warehouse." One of Chain's men stopped in front of the gas station and flicked a cigarette onto the ground. The others circled menacingly, their movements like predators testing their prey. My fists clenched, but I waited for the right moment to act. Bobby's voice came through the radio again. "Doctor." Chen, movement spotted on the north road. 5 motorcycles entering your area. Dr. Chen's reply was steady and calm. "Confirmed," recording their movements. Then Chains arrived. His eyes were cold, dark pools, betraying nothing but the calculated intent of a hunter closing in on his prey. His smile was a predator's grin, taunting and predatory. "This time, I'm just here to talk," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. I took a deliberate step toward him, each move exuding calm confidence. "We've got nothing to talk about, Chains. You need to leave," I said firmly. One of his men laughed derisively. "Are you the one who's going to stop us? This town owes us and we're here to collect." I ignored the jeers. Chains, sensing his usual tactics weren't working, stepped closer. But just then, a new message crackled through our radio network. "All stations alert! The main group is advancing from the south. 15 more motorcycles confirmed." Chains' grin widened. "Well, let's see what you've got, little town hero," he sneered. At that moment, Frank flipped the switch for the station's floodlights. Blinding beams illuminated Chains and his men, exposing them in full view. Simultaneously, our security cameras kicked in, recording their every move. Chains' smirk froze briefly, realizing his gang was being watched. Reports from other parts of the town confirmed the attack had begun. Maria's voice came through the radio. "The school is secure. The children are inside. They're approaching, but we're ready." The confidence on Chains' face began to waver. "This is just the beginning," he said, his tone tinged with frustration. "We'll show your town what we're really capable of." I locked eyes with him, drawing on everything I'd learned from years in war zones. Strength wasn't just about force. It was about unwavering resolve. "Then go ahead," I said evenly. Chains glared at me, then barked an order to his men, retreating temporarily. As they pulled back, the sounds of sirens and coordinated responses echoed from different corners of the town. In that moment, I knew they had launched their attack, but we had fortified our defense. The town was experiencing its first battle, and it was already teaching Chains a lesson he hadn't expected. As Chains and his men retreated, the voices on our radio network reported clashes from various parts of the town. While the danger at Miller's fuel stop had lessened, other groups of the gang were making moves near the school, clinic, and parking lots. This wasn't just a show of intimidation. It was an organized effort to break the town's resolve. Maria's voice came through the radio. "They've surrounded the school, but the children are safe. Security cameras are recording everything, and volunteers have barricaded the entrances." Dr. Chen's calm but alert tone followed. 4 motorcycles spotted near the clinic. "They're not attempting to enter, but are damaging windows. We're keeping watch." From the garage, James Washington reported, "They tried to force open the garage door, but the steel panels are holding. Cameras are recording everything. They're starting to pull back." The townsfolk were executing the plan perfectly. Every attack point was prepared for both defense and documentation. Chains and his gang had assumed we were an easy target, but now they were realizing the truth. This town had learned how to work together. Frank addressed everyone over the radio. "Stay in your positions, keep recording. No direct engagement, just observe and report." Chains, standing outside the gas station, turned and shouted, his voice booming across the lot. "This isn't over. We'll burn this town to the ground." I folded my arms and met his gaze. His threats no longer fazed me because I understood his limits. "You're right, Chains," I replied evenly. "It's not over, but how it ends is up to you." At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. Deputy Wilson's patrol car rounded the corner, its lights flashing as it pulled into the lot. Most of the gang began to retreat, though a few lingered, casting hard, defiant stares. Chain's smugness faltered, replaced by a simmering anger. "I'll see this through to the end," he growled. I narrowed my eyes. "You can try, but you're not alone anymore. Every move you make, every threat you utter, we're watching, recording, and reporting it all." Bobby's excited voice cut through the radio. "Camera footage is complete. We've got clear shots from the station and the clinic. Maria, we've noted the plates around the school." Finally, Chain's men began to withdraw. Within seconds, the rumble of their motorcycles faded down the road, and the streets of the town were quiet once more. Deputy Wilson stepped out of her car and approached me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We made it through this," she said. I nodded. This was just a test. The real challenge is still ahead. Frank emerged from the station and joined us, his face etched with determination. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "I know," I replied. "But when they return, they'll find a town that's learned how to fight back together." For the rest of the day, we worked with volunteers to review our systems at the station and other key defense points. We were strong, we were organized, and we were ready. The battle had only just begun, but in this fight, we knew we were never alone. In the darkness of the night, Miller's fuel stop buzzed quietly with activity. Word had spread that Chains and his gang had retreated, but we all knew this wasn't the end. It was only a trial run, a warning. When they returned, they would be stronger, more organized, and far more determined. Radio reports from across the town brought both hope and unease. Maria shared footage from the school's security cameras. James was compiling a detailed report of the attempted breach at his garage. Dr. Chen monitored movements around the clinic. Everyone was working together, strengthening the town's defenses with tireless resolve. Frank approached me, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Rachel," he said, his voice weary but resolute, "these people are starting to accomplish something together, but they still need help." I nodded. "Yes, Frank, they need help, but they're no longer afraid. That's the greatest victory we've achieved." Deputy Wilson joined us, spreading a map across the table. "We've got new intel," she said, marking critical points around the town. "Chains and his men are regrouping at an old warehouse outside of town." I studied the map. This information gave us a strategic advantage. We could anticipate Chains' next move. "This time, we won't wait for them to come to us," I said firmly. "It's time to corner them." Maria's voice came through the radio. "Rachel, we've reinforced the watch points around the school. Everyone's on high alert." "Great work," I replied. "We all need to be just as prepared. We don't know when they'll come, but when they do, we won't have a single weak spot." The crisis had transformed the town into a united front. That day, we truly became a community. Everyone trusted one another, worked together, and shared the same goal. Chains and his gang had no idea what kind of resistance they were about to face, but they would soon find out. Close to midnight, the radio network came alive again. Bobby's urgent voice echoed through the system. "Rachel, about 20 motorcycles heading up from the South Road. They've started." I took a deep breath and responded, "Everyone, stay in your positions." "Stick to the plan. No panic." Frank slung his shotgun over his shoulder and gazed out into the night. "This time will be different," he said. I narrowed my eyes at the horizon. Chains and his gang were coming once again to bring chaos to our town. But this time, they wouldn't find frightened individuals. They'd face a strong, organized community. As the roar of engines drew closer, the town lit up with floodlights. Camera flashes flickered from every corner. Chains and his men found themselves under the watchful eyes of countless cameras. This wasn't just a fight, it was resistance, and we were going to win. That night, the lights in Riverside Junction never went out. It took hours for Chains and his gang to leave, but when they did, it was for good. What drove them away wasn't just the courage of a few individuals, it was the collective strength of a community that had come together like a family. By morning, hope and pride filled every corner of the town. Miller's fuel stop had returned to its quiet state. Frank walked up to me, handing me a cup of coffee. "This town owes you a lot, Rachel," he said. I shook my head and smiled softly. "This town owes itself, Frank. I just showed them how strong they could be when they stood together." And that morning, under the Texas sun, our little town would never be the same again. The fear was gone. The loneliness was gone. Riverside Junction had become a symbol of strength born from unity.